Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into something that's been on my mind a lot lately, the economics of space exploration.
Well, that's a fascinating one.
Yeah. So you guys have sent us a ton of articles about the Indian Space Research Organization.
ISRO. Yeah.
ISRO, yeah.
Right.
And some of their achievements are just mind-blowing, honestly.
Yeah, it's really incredible what they've been able to achieve, especially considering,
Yeah.
they do it on a shoestring budget compared to like NASA and other agencies.
It's unbelievable. I mean, they landed near the lunar South Pole with Chandrayaan-3.
Mm-hmm.
They sent an orbiter to Mars with Mangalian.
Yeah.
And their whole budget is less than what Hollywood spent on the movie Gravity.
That's wild when you put it like that.
Like, how is that even possible?
It's the question everyone's asking.
Yeah.
And these articles you sent in,
Yeah.
they really highlight a key point of comparison, which is the salaries of ISRO employees.
The salaries, yeah. There's that story about someone's cousin who was working on Chandrayaan-2 components, and they were making something like 17,000 rupees.
Wow.
That's like, I can't even imagine
Nah.
someone doing a similar job here making anything close to that.
It seems like a huge discrepancy at first glance, right?
Yeah.
Kind of feeds into that idea that maybe ISRO is cutting corners or relying on, much cheaper labor.
Right.
But that's where this idea of purchasing power parity comes in, or PPP.
PPP, okay, break that down for me a little.
Yeah, so essentially PPP helps you understand like how far your money actually goes in different countries.
Gotcha.
It takes into account, the cost of living.
Mm-hmm.
So while that 17,000 rupees might seem shockingly low in India, it can buy you a lot more than you'd think compared to, say, that same amount of money here.
Right.
With our higher cost of living.
So it's not really a fair comparison just straight up looking at those numbers.
Exactly. It's more nuanced than that.
Okay, but it can't just be salaries, right? There's
Yeah.
got to be other reasons why they're so cost effective.
Totally. And the articles point to a few things. One that really jumps out is ISRO's commitment to homegrown technology.
Okay. I've heard that phrase, but I don't fully get it.
So unlike a lot of space agencies that rely heavily on like outsourcing to these big international corporations,
Yeah.
ISRO designs and manufactures a lot of its tech in-house.
So they're doing everything themselves, basically.
Well, a lot of it. It's a more self-reliant approach.
But what's the advantage there?
So by keeping the design and production within the organization, they have more control over costs. And they keep the expertise in-house.
Right.
So they're not paying those like super inflated prices that come with outsourcing to these massive companies.
So they're saving money and building their own expertise.
Like win-win.
Yeah, totally. Oh, the articles also mentioned something about like a historical event that kind of shaped how ISRO does things.
Right, the 1974 embargo.
Fill me in on that.
So after India did its first nuclear tests back in 1974, several countries in the West, they slapped an embargo on India. They basically cut off access to a lot of advanced technologies.
So they couldn't get the tech they needed.
Right. They thought it would cripple India's space program.
I mean, I would think so too.
Makes sense.
Did they just like give up on space at that point?
No. Quite the opposite, actually. This became a catalyst for their whole approach.
Really?
Yeah. They were forced to be self-reliant. They doubled down on developing their own technology and their own solutions. And it fostered this like culture of, innovation, resourcefulness.
So like the roadblock actually made them even more innovative and resourceful?
It's a pretty incredible example of turning adversity into advantage.
That's so cool. And that ties into another thing, right? Like their approach to risk is different too.
Absolutely.
So how does that compare to like how NASA does things?
Well, NASA often invests in building multiple engineering models.
Right.
And they rely heavily on insurance to kind of mitigate risk.
Yeah.
ISRO takes a bolder approach.
In what way?
They often build single-use spacecraft.
Wait, so they only make one?
Yeah, pretty much, which obviously carries a much higher risk of failure.
That's intense, putting all their eggs in one basket like that?
It does seem that way, right? But this calculated risk also really cuts down development costs.
Oh, I see.
They've got this make-it-work mentality, which has obviously led to some amazing achievements.
So they're willing to take bigger risks to reach those goals on a tight budget.
Yeah, it's a pattern for sure.
For sure. But what about the people actually working on these missions? Does this approach affect them in any way?
Well, the articles talk about the amazing dedication of ISRO employees.
Oh, yeah.
Like you see these small teams working crazy hours, often without overtime pay.
Wow.
Driven by pure passion for the mission.
That's pretty incredible. But can they keep that up, long term?
That's a great question, and one we'll dive into more as we go.
Yeah.
It's clear that the human element, the passion, the commitment, is a big part of their success.
It sounds like ISRO has figured out how to do a lot with a little, like it's this blend of economic factors like that PPP and homegrown technology,
Right.
plus this whole culture of self-reliance and risk-taking.
Definitely.
But are there downsides to this?
That is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one we're going to explore more as we continue our deep dive.
Ooh, a cliffhanger.
We'll look at the other side of this and see if this whole frugal innovation model is actually sustainable in the long run.
Okay, I'm hooked. Can't wait to hear more.
Should be interesting. Welcome back to our deep dive into ISRO.
Oh yeah, this is fascinating stuff.
Right. We're really getting into how they pull off so much on such a limited budget.
Exactly. In part one, we were like blown away by their ingenuity, their resourcefulness, that make it work attitude.
Right.
But you mentioned there might be another side to this?
Yeah.
Like a potential downside to all this?
Well, that's the thing, right? ISRO's approach, it's definitely led to incredible achievements. But some of these articles you sent in, they raise some concerns about whether it's sustainable, in the long term.
Okay, so what kind of downsides are we talking about here?
Well, one concern is that this constant need to save money, it can lead to compromises in certain areas.
Oh, like what?
Some experts argue that ISRO missions, sometimes they prioritize cost effectiveness over scientific output.
So instead of focusing on like getting the most data they can, they're more focused on just like proving they can get to space.
Yeah, one commenter specifically mentioned Chandrayaan-3.
Right.
He said, the landing near the lunar South Pole, that was historic.
Huge achievement.
But the main goal was more about showing off the tech than doing deep scientific research.
So they could have done more experiments if they weren't so worried about the budget.
That's the argument some people are making.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a trade-off.
Yeah, I see that. And there's that other thing we talked about with their workforce.
Right.
The whole working long hours without overtime thing.
Yeah, that stood out to you too, huh?
Well, it's inspiring, but I can't help but think it might lead to burnout.
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
Or make it harder to keep talented people around.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if you're a skilled scientist or engineer and you feel undervalued, overworked,
right,
you might start looking for better opportunities.
For sure.
And that could hurt ISRO's success down the line.
So it's tough, right? Like, how do you balance keeping costs down and making sure your employees are happy?
It's a challenge. And then there's that whole changing landscape of the space industry.
All right, with private companies getting involved.
Yeah, that could really shake things up for ISRO.
So how do you see that playing out? Like, will it affect their cost-effective model?
Tough to say for sure, but it'll definitely bring new challenges and opportunities.
Like what?
Well, these private companies, their main focus is profit.
Yeah.
So their priorities might be different from a government agency like ISRO.
So we might see a shift towards projects that'll make money.
Right, rather than purely scientific missions.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's the whole competition thing, right?
Exactly.
Can ISRO keep their costs low when they're up against these companies with tons of funding?
Huge question. So we've seen how ISRO achieved all these amazing things with limited resources.
Yeah.
But looking ahead, there are some big questions.
Big time. Can they keep their workforce motivated? Can they adapt to this whole private sector thing?
Right. And it all comes down to this. How can they adapt and thrive in this new era without losing those core values?
Yeah.
The innovation, the efficiency.
If they're at a crossroads.
Exactly. And that's where we'll pick things up in part 3.
Ooh, okay.
We'll look at ISRO's plans for the future, the role of these private companies, and what lessons we can all learn from their journey.
I'm ready. This is getting good. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It's been quite a ride exploring how ISRO does so much with so little.
It really is a testament to ingenuity and resourcefulness.
Absolutely. We've seen how they basically turn limitations into opportunities.
Right.
And just consistently exceed expectations.
Yeah.
But as we look ahead, the big question is, can they keep this up?
Can they keep this momentum going, especially as the space landscape keeps changing?
Right. We talked about those potential downsides like burnout and those challenges from the private sector. But what about ISR's future? Do our sources say anything about their plans?
They point to some pretty ambitious goals coming up.
Like what?
Goals that'll definitely test their whole cost-effectiveness thing.
Okay.
One that stands out is their plan for a manned mission to the moon by 2040.
A manned mission to the moon. That's a whole other level.
It is.
That's always been the dream, right? Sending people to the moon.
Absolutely.
But that's got to be way more expensive than sending robots.
Oh, yeah. Way more complex, too.
So how do they plan to do that and still stick to their budget?
That's the million-dollar question. It'll probably force them to change things up a bit.
You think so?
Yeah, the article suggests they'll need to find new ways to get funding, maybe even team up with some private companies.
To get the tech and expertise they need.
Exactly.
It's like they're walking a tightrope.
It is.
Keeping their core values of efficiency and self-reliance, but also embracing these new partnerships and adapting to, human spaceflight.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those private companies and their role in India's space future.
Right.
It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
We talked about the challenges, the competition for resources and talent.
Yeah.
But could there be benefits for ISRO too?
Potentially.
Like what?
Well, all these private companies coming in could mean a lot more money flowing into India's space industry.
Oh, I see.
And that could free up ISRO to focus on those bigger scientific missions like that moon landing.
Without having to pay for everything themselves.
Right. So maybe instead of seeing them as just competition, they become partners.
Yeah.
Each one bringing something different to the table.
To advance India's space program as a whole.
Exactly. It's a shift in perspective that could be key for their success.
Realizing that working together is just as important as doing it all yourself.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me that ISRO's story, it's about so much more than just space.
It really is.
It shows what humans can do when they're creative.
And determined.
Yeah, it reminds us that sometimes limitations can actually make us more innovative.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main thing you want our listeners to think about?
I would say it's this, you don't always need a ton of resources to do amazing things. It's more about creating a culture of innovation.
Yeah.
Embracing those limitations as opportunities.
Right.
And never underestimating human ingenuity.
So well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into ISRO.
My pleasure.
It's been a journey that's really challenged our thinking.
Yeah.
And reminded us that anything is possible. Until next time, keep looking up and remember the sky's not the limit when there are footprints on the moon.